Luxembourg is one of Europe's smallest countries that used to build its economy around iron and steel, but don't let its size fool you. It's eyeing outer space to source minerals through asteroid mining. The first mission is expected within the next 3 years. Much of this effort is due to Etienne Schneider, the Luxembourg's Deputy Prime Minister, who wants to turn the country into an outer space powerhouse.
One of Europe's tiniest states now holds claim to being a giant in the space industry. Luxembourg, known as the leading private banking center in the Eurozone, now generates nearly 2% of its annual GDP from the space industry, the highest of any country. Luxembourg's Space Resources Initiative is its plan to position the country as the European heart of exploration and use of space resources. Space mining is Luxembourg's present focus. From around 30 companies in Luxembourg's space sector, there is a vast pool of talent and expertise in satellite telecommunications. They draw on the pool for the development of extracting resources from the moon or from thousands of asteroids. The first asteroid prospecting missions are expected within the next 3 years. Eventually, celestial mining firms hope to harvest materials that can be processed in space and then used for on-site construction to sustain human life in space or, in the very long term, shipped back and sold on Earth.
Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, welcome to CGTN.
Thank you.
You have been nicknamed by some as the space miner in your country. How did that name come from?
Well, I guess it comes from my Space Resource.lu initiative, which I launched some 2 years ago, where we really want to bring our country into space, meaning that we want to develop commercial activities in space. And that's an initiative we took 2 years ago, as I said, and which has a tremendous success.
But people would say that's quite ambitious for a country like Luxembourg and having an outer space plan.
35 years ago, we launched, as a government, together with private investors, the satellite company SES, which is now one of the biggest commercial satellite operators in the world. And that was, at that time, a very ambitious idea. And many people didn't believe in Luxembourg being able to develop this kind of space activities, but now we are one of the leaders.
There are several things that you need to handle, I guess, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister. One is the international legislation, whether we have some agreements about that. Secondly, of course, technological. And thirdly, what about the international cooperation in terms of developing it, because Luxembourg will not be able to do it alone. So all of these, how could it happen?
When I was discussing with many different startups in this kind of business, they were telling me that they've got some problems to find investors because the property question is not solved by the United Nations Space Treaty, which dates back to 1967. And at that time, doing business in space or doing space mining was just science fiction. So nobody was addressing this question. So what we did was in analysis of the international legal framework, and then we decided to get a proper legal framework in Luxembourg, which allows companies to harvest minerals, for instance, in space and to own them, to possess them, and to commercialize them. And that's a very, very important step in order to allow these companies to develop themselves, in order to make their lives easier because they need to find investors. What we are working on right now is to put in place a fund, an investment fund, in order to invest into these startups. And that's what we are discussing right now with different investors. And I guess we will have this fund in a few months' time.
What kind of scale are you looking at in the very near future?
We want to be, let's say, the host nation of all these companies which want to develop space business in space. But what we are doing, and that's why I'm here in China today, is signing agreements with other like-minded countries, with countries with whom we can cooperate and collaborate in order to develop all these techniques and technologies. Because
what kind of areas can you develop with China? I understand you're here to discuss with the space agency here in this country.
You know, there's quite a lot of different areas where we want to cooperate. For instance, exchange of information, then working together on research and development activities, putting our forces together. My aim is to bring all the like-minded countries around the table and to discuss together with them what are our aims, where do we want to get, and how can we do so as soon as possible and as cheap as possible.
Now you see a lot of debates in Europe when it comes to immigrants, when it comes to how to solicit the best talents from around the world. How do you, as the Deputy Prime Minister of your country, see that issue?
We have always had a completely open economy. We have always been completely open to all kinds of investors and also to all kinds of people who wanted to work in Luxembourg.
But now people say the trend is different. The wind is blowing the other way around. People want to say, my country first.
Luxembourg counts now 47% of foreigners living in the country, and we don't even have a right-wing party which is fighting against these foreigners. So, you know, everybody in Luxembourg knows that we need this foreign workforce, we need this immigration, and we need foreign capital to be invested.
What about outside your country? You're part of the EU. I mean, you cannot draw on your own policy just like that. You have to negotiate with the rest of the EU countries. Yeah. What about that part?
I must tell you that it's something which makes me a little bit sad. If I'm seeing these more nationalistic debates getting back into the European Union, in some of the European Union countries, I can just tell them that it's not the right way to go. And it has never been a solution to anything.
But the question is your voice big enough, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, inside the EU?
Yeah, apparently not. Apparently not, because otherwise some countries would not close their doors as they're doing or trying to do right now.
So
but
what can you do?
We are fighting for it. We are fighting for it on the European Union level. But as you said, we are a small country with small voting rights. But on the other hand, we are trying to convince other countries to stay open and to not abolish immigration. Because you know, Europe is quite an old continent, and people are getting quite old, or are quite old in
aging
Europe.
population.
Exactly. Aging of the population will be a big issue in the years to come. So we should be a little bit wiser and a little bit more forward-looking.
Okay, the scenario is people will listen to you, or they see their own interest in listening to ideas like what you have just said. The other scenario is they wouldn't. There are only two options. And therefore, how would Luxembourg be able to function if the option is not the best one that you would prefer?
Nobody can forbid Luxembourg to be an open country and to accept immigration into our country. So, you know, if the other countries don't want to understand how important immigration is, not only for the economy but also for the survival of their countries in the long term, we understand it, and we will continue having immigration in Luxembourg.
And therefore, there are very confusing political landscape in the EU as to who will be the leadership, who has the quality of the leadership, which direction will the leadership lead the rest of the EU to go, even though it is a very equal membership entity. So, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, what do you make of this apparent chaotic situation? What is the logic that Luxembourg is keen on among all these mixed up pictures?
The years after 2008 have been very difficult for many of the European Union countries. And so the country is more and more divided on different important European topics.
That's right.
And we are quite happy to see that finally France and Germany seem to go into the same direction, meaning that Europe must become stronger again. But still, you're right, there are some countries which are going into the other direction. And that's a problem we will have to tackle. But the good thing is, you know, governments come and they go again. So the policy is changing also every 4 to 5 years. So if you have countries which are, let's say, more Eurosceptic, you have the chance that maybe a few years later there will be another government which will be more favorable.
Luxembourg, of course, is very keen on designing its own blueprint about its own future. In this big picture, where does the relationship between Luxembourg and China fall?
China was always a very good partner. And there is a big difference, I guess, between Luxembourg and many other, or let's say at least many big European countries towards China. Because many of them want to protect their economies against Chinese investors, because they want to protect their national champions. We never had national champions in that way, apart from the steel industry. Right. But you know, we never closed our doors, and we never tried to avoid Chinese investments in Luxembourg. The opposite is the case. We are coming to China in order to find investors which might use Luxembourg as their European hub, as their gateway to Europe, and we really help them to develop their activities.
Right.
And I think that's a big difference between many other countries. We never had any single problem with one of our Chinese investors in Luxembourg. And you know that the Bank of China is the first Chinese bank outside of China. And it was, they came to Luxembourg. And Madame Zhou Lihong, who is the CEO of the bank, she's a good friend of mine, because due to all our collaboration, due to the fact that we really have very tight links to our Chinese community in Luxembourg, there's mutual trust and understanding.
Right. But what about the Belt and Road Initiative? There are different views about that. Some of those from Europe might be skeptical about it. What is your view, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister? What does China want to do you think, with this?
You know, first of all, we fully support this initiative because we think it's the right way to do. Second, and here again, Luxembourg was the first non-Asian country to become a member of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So there again, and I can tell you that there was some pressure from some other countries.
What kind of pressure?
Pressure not to become a member of this.
Remember at the time when you were making this decision, what was the pressure that you were facing at the time?
You know,
would you like to describe in words to me?
I will not tell you which country, but it was a very big country, which didn't really want us to become a part of this initiative. But, you know, we didn't care about that because, as I told you before, we have a really good experience with our Chinese partners, and that's why we wanted to show that we will continue supporting China in developing their activities. And the One Belt, One Road initiative is really something which we think will be in the interest not only of China, but of all other countries which participate in it.
Which stage do you think that has already been developing to?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question which I will not be able to answer to you right now because, you know, I don't have the insight into all of these activities.
There are some issues, as you said, sir, you're very keen on, and yet maybe different compared to some of the other countries. One of those is about what to do with tech companies internationally. People see these companies are becoming sometimes even bigger than middle-sized countries, and data providing a lot of power. But at the same time, they also provide a lot of convenience to people that are using these services. How do you see, as a national leader, the growth of these kind of companies and the relationship between countries, governments, and these businesses?
You know, I don't really see a big problem having these big companies. I see more problem in cybersecurity, protection of information, of data. All this will be, or is already, a tremendous challenge for the countries in order to regulate all this, and, you know, in order to make sure that your data is not used when you don't want it to be used by others. So I see the problem more in that perspective. And then maybe on the maybe there's another problem. We have to make sure that these companies also pay taxes somewhere. Because,
and that could be an issue. for example, your country is related to right now.
Absolutely. That is an issue, and it is an important issue. And we have to make sure that these companies have to pay their fair share somewhere. But nowadays, with all the possibilities they have, and due to the huge impact they can have on nation states, they are quite successful in avoiding taxes. And I think we should find a way to make them pay their fair share wherever they are active. Not in one single country, but wherever they are active.
So thank you so much, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, for being with us.